It was just another quiet morning in my little Phuket apartment. I was making coffee, half awake, when I checked my email, mostly spam and promotions. But then I saw her name, Namthip. After all this time, my hands froze above the keyboard. My throat went dry. Just seeing her name again, it was like someone reached inside and twisted something I thought had already healed. I didn't know whether to open it or delete it, but of course, I opened it. It was short, polite, like we were old friends catching up after a long break. But all I could hear in my head was the last thing she ever said to me right before she walked out with the paperwork, the money, and what was left of my trust. I didn't marry for lust. I married for peace. I just wanted someone to grow old with, someone who'd sit beside me when the world got quiet. She told me I gave her hope, that I made her feel safe, and I believed every word. But in the end, I was just her next legal case. Another client to be closed, not a husband to be loved. My name is Hal. I was 61 when I moved to Phuket to start fresh, and what I'm about to tell you still hurts more than I can admit out loud. But maybe, just maybe, it'll help someone else spot the signs I ignored. If you've ever been in love later in life, if you've ever thought, this time, it's different, then I hope you'll stick around. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I read every one. And for those of you who keep coming back video after video, a super thank you. You've given me a place to speak the truth without shame. That means more than you know. This story is hard to tell, but I need to tell it. Let me take you back to where it all started. I remember that morning like it was yesterday. The tea was still warm in my hands when Namthip looked up from her phone with those dark eyes that always made me feel like I mattered. "It's approved, Hal," she said, her voice soft but triumphant. "Your marriage visa, we did it." I set down my cup and watched her smile spread across her face. It was the kind of smile that made me forget I was 61 years old. Forget that my first marriage had ended in lawyers and silence. I forget that my sister's funeral had left me so empty, I couldn't even taste the food I cooked. "We're finally a team," she whispered, reaching across the small wooden table in her apartment's back garden. Her fingers were cool against mine, and when she lifted my hand to her lips and kissed my knuckles, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, stupid, dangerous hope. The kind that makes you believe you can start over, that maybe the best parts of your life aren't behind you after all. But even in that perfect moment, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 3 times during our celebration. Each time, she'd glance at the screen and say, "Work stuff. You know how it is." I did know how it was. Namthip worked as a paralegal for an immigration lawyer downtown, and she was always getting calls from desperate expats who needed help with visa problems. It's actually how we met. But something about the way she held the phone that morning, angled away from me, made my chest tighten just a little. "Important client?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. She tucked a strand of black hair behind her ear and shrugged. "Always important to someone," she said. "But not more important than this, than us." She squeezed my hand, and I pushed the unease away. This was our moment, our victory. I'd spent 6 months navigating Thai bureaucracy, paying fees, providing documents, all so I could legally stay here with the woman I loved. And now it was done. "So what happens next?" I asked. She tilted her head, that little gesture she did when she was thinking. "Next, we build our life together. Properly. No more tourist visa runs, no more uncertainty. You're here to stay, Hal. We both are." The garden was quiet except for the sound of traffic in the distance and the gentle clink of her bangles when she moved. I wanted to freeze that moment, hold on to it forever. Because somewhere deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew things were about to change. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't even look at it. "Turn it off," I said, surprising myself with the boldness. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes. You're right. Today should just be ours. But she didn't turn it off. She just flipped it face down and reached for her tea. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself a lot of things that morning that turned out to be lies. 6 months earlier, I'd stepped off the plane at Phuket International with 2 suitcases and no real plan beyond getting away from everything that reminded me of failure. My divorce from Linda had been finalized 3 months prior, and my sister Margaret's cancer had taken her just 2 weeks after that. 53 years of marriage counseling, and chemo appointments and lawyers, and suddenly I was alone in a house that felt like a museum of someone else's life. My neighbor in Portland, an old line cook from my restaurant days, had suggested Thailand. Food's incredible, people are kind, and your dollar goes 3 times as far, he'd said over beers. Just try it for a few months. What's the worst that could happen? So I'd sold the house, split the money with Linda per our agreement, and bought a one-way ticket to a place I'd never even dreamed of visiting. The cooking classes were supposed to be temporary, something to fill the hours and maybe teach me a few tricks I could use when I got back to Oregon. The school was in Old Town Phuket, run by a cheerful woman named Siri who treated every student like family. That's where I learned to make proper pad thai, where I finally understood the difference between Thai basil and regular basil, where I started to feel like maybe I could rebuild something from the pieces of my old life. The immigration seminar was Siri's idea. Many Farang students have visa questions, she'd explained. This lawyer, very good, very honest. She sends assistant to answer questions for free. I almost didn't go. I'd been managing fine on tourist visas, doing border runs to Malaysia every few months, but Siri insisted, and I'd learned not to argue with Thai women who wanted to help you. Namthip walked into that community center classroom like she owned the place. Professional blazer, confident stride, perfect English with just enough accent to remind you she was local. She spent an hour explaining visa options, work permits, marriage visas, retirement visas. Most of the expats asked the same questions they could have Googled. But when she started talking about the marriage visa, something in her voice shifted. More personal. Like she actually cared whether these lonely foreign men found a way to stay. After the seminar, she approached me directly. You're the chef, right? Siri mentioned you. Harold Murphy? I nodded, surprised she knew my name. I'd love to talk more about your visa situation, if you have time. There might be better options than those border runs you've been doing. We walked to a coffee shop around the corner, and I found myself telling her things I hadn't planned to share. About Linda, about Margaret, about how cooking in Thailand felt like discovering food all over again. You seem like someone who deserves stability, she said after I'd finished rambling about my sister's last weeks in hospice. The tourist visa life, it's exhausting. Always temporary, always uncertain. You should consider putting down real roots here. The way she said it, looking directly into my eyes, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not pitied, not judged, just seen. We started meeting for coffee once a week to discuss my visa options, then twice a week. Then she started suggesting little day trips to show me the real Phuket beyond the tourist areas. She knew every family-run restaurant, every hidden temple, every local market where you could buy the best mangoes or the freshest fish. She made me feel like I was discovering secrets that other foreigners never got to see. Most expats, they live in bubbles, she told me one afternoon as we shared some tam at a roadside stall. Same friends, same restaurants, same complaints about Thailand. But you're different, Hal. You actually want to understand this place, to belong here. Her hand brushed mine across the table, and I felt that dangerous flutter of possibility. Maybe this wasn't just about visas anymore. The proposal happened on a Tuesday morning in February. We'd been seeing each other for 3 months, and I'd been carrying the ring around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. Not a big diamond, nothing flashy, just a simple gold band with a small emerald that reminded me of her eyes. We were walking along Kata Beach before sunrise, and the sky was turning that soft pink color that only exists in the tropics. Namthip, I said, stopping suddenly in the sand. My heart was pounding like I was 20 years old again. I know this might seem fast, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. She turned to face me, and I could see her trying to read my expression in the dim light. I love you. I love the way you make me see this place, the way you make me feel like I belong somewhere again. Will you marry me? For a moment, she just stared at the ring in my palm. Then she looked up at me, and I saw something flicker across her face. Relief? Calculation? I couldn't tell, and in that moment, I didn't want to know. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Hal, I think we can make each other happy. Not the most romantic acceptance I'd ever heard, but it felt honest, real. Like we were two adults making a practical decision about love. She moved into my apartment the following week. Not gradually, the way couples usually do, but all at once. 2 suitcases and a box of papers that she kept in our bedroom closet. I travel light, she explained when I commented on how few possessions she had. Too many things just weigh you down. She immediately started organizing my life in ways I hadn't expected. Sorting through my documents, calling my old landlord in Portland to help resolve some issues with my security deposit, even reorganizing my kitchen so it was more efficient. You're very kind, Hal, but not very organized, she said with a laugh as she threw away expired medications and old receipts. Lucky for you, I'm good at these things. It felt wonderful, actually. Like having a competent partner who could handle the details I'd always struggled with. Linda had been organized too, but in a controlling way that made me feel incompetent. Namthip made it feel like we were a team. The wedding was small, just us, 2 witnesses from her work, and a judge at the district office in Phuket town. Namthip wore a simple blue dress, and I wore the only suit I'd brought to Thailand. We exchanged vows in Thai and English, signed papers, took photos. It felt significant but not overwhelming. Like the beginning of something sustainable rather than some grand romantic gesture. That night, she introduced me to her Uncle Mook, who she said could help us navigate the marriage visa process more efficiently. He was a middle-aged man with careful eyes and a firm handshake who seemed to know everyone in the immigration office. Hal, he said in accented English, Namthip tells me you want to do everything properly. I respect that, but sometimes proper can be very slow, very expensive. I can help you find better way. What kind of better way? I asked. Namthip squeezed my arm. Uncle Mook has connections. He can make sure your paperwork gets processed quickly, that you don't get stuck in the bureaucracy for months. It costs a little extra, but it's worth it for the peace of mind. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, made it seem like the most natural thing in the world. Just part of how things worked here. I paid Uncle Mook $1,500 up front. For processing fees and expedited service, he explained. Your visa will be approved within 6 weeks instead of 6 months. Namthip translated some of the details into Thai for him, and I noticed how comfortable they seemed together, like they'd done this before. But I pushed that thought away. This was normal. This was how business worked in Thailand. I was just learning the system. The bank statement arrived on a Thursday morning in March. I almost didn't open it, since Namthip had been handling most of our financial paperwork, but something made me sit down at the kitchen table and look through the transactions. There it was, clear as day. A $2,800 wire transfer I didn't remember authorizing. My stomach dropped. Namthip, I called out. She was getting ready for work in the bedroom, and I could hear her moving around, the soft sound of jewelry clinking. Can you come here for a minute? She appeared in the doorway, wearing a professional dress I hadn't seen before, checking her phone as she walked. What is it, honey? I'm running a bit late. I held up the bank statement. This transfer. I don't remember making it. She glanced at the paper, and for just a moment, her expression went blank. Then she smiled and sat down next to me. Oh, that. Remember? We talked about the additional visa processing fees. Uncle Mook said there were some new requirements, extra documentation costs. You said it was fine. I stared at her, trying to remember the conversation. We'd talked about money several times over the past few weeks, usually while I was cooking or she was getting ready for work. Had I agreed to this? The amount seemed high, but everything in Thailand seemed expensive when you were dealing with government bureaucracy. I guess I just don't remember agreeing to that specific amount, I said slowly. Hal, you worry too much about details, she said, her voice gentle but firm. That's why you have me. To handle these things so you don't have to stress about every little transaction. The visa is more complicated than we thought, but Uncle Mook is taking care of everything. Trust me. She kissed my forehead, and I felt that familiar flutter of gratitude. This was what partnership was supposed to feel like, wasn't it? Having someone competent enough to handle the complicated stuff while you focused on other things. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other small changes. Namthip was working later more often, sometimes not coming home until 9 or 10 at night. Emergency cases, she'd explain. Immigration law is unpredictable. People get desperate, and they need help right away. She'd started locking her phone with a passcode, something she'd never done before. When I mentioned it, she laughed. Client confidentiality, honey. I handle sensitive information. It's just good practice. The perfume incident happened on a Saturday morning. I was cleaning out her car, just trying to be helpful, when I found a small bottle of perfume wedged between the passenger seat and center console. Not the light floral fragrance Namthip usually wore, but something heavier, muskier, more expensive. When I brought it into the house, she was in the shower. Found this in your car, I said when she came out, holding up the bottle. She looked at it for a moment, then shrugged. Oh, that. One of my clients left it. She was so grateful for the help with her visa that she wanted to give me a gift. Sweet, but not really my style. She took the bottle from my hands and tossed it in the trash. Some people don't know how to show appreciation appropriately. I wanted to believe her, needed to believe her, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. I'd already failed at one marriage. I'd already lost my sister, my career, my sense of home. If I was wrong about Namthip, if I was making the same mistakes I'd made with Linda, then what did that say about my judgment? About my ability to read people I was supposed to love? So I cooked dinner that night, made her favorite massaman curry from scratch, spent 3 hours getting the spice blend just right. When she came home at almost 11, tired and distracted, she barely touched the food. I ate something at the office, she said, not meeting my eyes. But it smells delicious, honey. Thank you. She went to bed early, and I sat alone in the kitchen, eating curry that tasted like ash and trying to convince myself that everything was normal. The knock on our door came at 7:30 on a Sunday morning. I was still in my pajamas making coffee when I heard the aggressive hammering. Namthip was at her desk in the living room, working on what she called weekend case files, but she looked up sharply at the sound. Are you expecting someone? She asked, but her voice had an edge to it I'd never heard before. I opened the door to find a red-faced Australian man in his 50s, sweating through a polo shirt and looking furious. Where is she? He demanded, pushing past me into the apartment. Where's Namthip? I know she lives here. Namthip appeared in the living room doorway, and the man pointed at her accusingly. There you are. I want my fucking money back. Now. Sir, please calm down, Namthip said, her professional voice firmly in place. I don't know what you think. But the man cut her off. Don't give me that bullshit. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The marriage package. $8,000 for a guaranteed Thai wife and visa processing. You took my money 6 months ago, and I haven't heard from you since. My blood went cold. Marriage package. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly silent apartment. I looked at Namthip, waiting for her to explain, to clear up what was obviously some kind of misunderstanding. But she was staring at the floor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I think you have the wrong person, I said to the Australian man, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. My wife works for an immigration law firm. She helps people with legitimate visa issues. The man laughed, a bitter sound. Your wife? Jesus Christ, mate, you're one of them, aren't you? Another sucker who fell for the routine? Get out, Namthip said suddenly, her voice sharp and commanding. Get out of our home right now, or I'll call the police. The man looked back and forth between us, and I saw something like pity cross his face when he looked at me. Sorry, mate, he said quietly. Didn't realize you were in this deep, but you should know what kind of business your wife really runs. After he left, the apartment felt like a tomb. Namthip sat down heavily on the couch, her head in her hands. I stood in the middle of the living room, still holding my coffee mug, trying to process what had just happened. Namthip, I said finally, what was he talking about? She looked up at me, and her eyes were filled with tears. Real tears, I thought. They had to be real. It's complicated, Hal, she said, her voice breaking. There are things about my work, about my past that I haven't told you, but it's not what you think. It's not what he made it sound like. I sat down next to her on the couch, and she immediately curled into my side. That man, he hired me before I met you. He wanted help finding a wife, and yes, I connected him with women who were looking for foreign husbands. It's not illegal, Hal. It's matchmaking. But he said marriage package, $8,000. My voice sounded hollow. She was crying harder now, her whole body shaking against mine. Some clients, they want guarantees. They want to pay up front for the whole process. Immigration help, introductions, wedding planning. I was trying to build a business, Hal. I was trying to be independent. But then I met you, and everything changed. You met me through the immigration seminar. She nodded against my chest. Yes, but I'd already taken his money. I couldn't just give it back without explaining why, and I didn't want you to think I was some kind of marriage broker. I was trying to figure out how to handle it when he disappeared. Stopped answering calls, stopped responding to emails. I thought maybe he'd found someone on his own. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly it hurt. The alternative was that everything between us was a lie, that I was just another client in her marriage business, that the woman I'd fallen in love with had been playing a role from the very beginning. So you were going to give him his money back? I asked. Yes, she said, looking up at me with those tear-filled eyes. I was waiting for the right time to tell you about it, to explain the whole situation. I didn't want you to misunderstand. She reached up and touched my face. Hal, I love you. What we have is real. I know how this looks, but you have to believe me. You're not like them. You're not a client. You're my husband. I held her while she cried, and I told myself that people make mistakes, that everyone has complicated pasts, that love means giving someone the benefit of the doubt. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew that something fundamental had shifted. The perfect trust I'd felt with her was cracked, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. But I also wasn't sure I was strong enough to face the truth if that trust was misplaced. After the Australian man's visit, Namthip changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small ways that accumulated like sand in a wound. She started leaving earlier for work and coming home later. She stopped asking about my day, stopped suggesting weekend trips to hidden beaches or local markets. When I tried to bring up the marriage business incident, she would get quiet and distant, saying things like, I thought we'd move past that, or I don't want to keep reliving my mistakes. My visa application, which Uncle Mook had promised would be processed quickly, seemed to be stuck in bureaucratic limbo. When I asked Namthip about it, she would sigh and mention new immigration rules or unexpected complications. These things take time, Hal, she'd say, not meeting my eyes. The government is cracking down on foreign marriages. We just have to be patient. The phone calls became more frequent and more secretive. She'd step out onto the balcony or into the bedroom, speaking in rapid Thai with an urgency that made my chest tight. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd give vague answers about work emergencies or family issues. But I'd lived with this woman for months now, and I knew the difference between her professional voice and her personal voice. These calls sounded personal. One evening in late April, I was cooking dinner when her phone rang in the living room. She was in the shower, and the phone kept ringing and ringing. Without really thinking about it, I walked over to see who was calling. The screen showed a name I didn't recognize, David K. But what caught my attention was the message preview below the name. When can we meet again? My visa situation is getting urgent. When Namthip came out of the shower, I was still standing by her phone, staring at the screen. Someone named David called, I said carefully. He sent a message about his visa situation. She looked at the phone, then at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. David is a client, she said finally. American guy, very complicated case. He's been having problems with his retirement visa. The message sounded personal. The words came out before I could stop them. She dried her hair with a towel, not looking at me. Some clients get emotionally attached to their cases. They think lawyers are also therapists. I try to maintain boundaries, but it's not always easy. Her explanation sounded rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for this conversation. That night, I lay awake listening to her breathe beside me, trying to remember when I'd started feeling like a stranger in my own bed. The woman sleeping next to me used to curl up against me, used to whisper sleepy endearments in broken English mixed with Thai. Now she slept on her side of the bed, facing away from me, her body curved in a way that seemed defensive. The conversation I overheard happened 3 nights later. I'd gotten up around 2 a.m. to get water from the kitchen when I heard her voice coming from the balcony. She was speaking Thai in a low, urgent tone, and even though I couldn't understand the words, I could hear the intimacy in her voice, the kind of intimacy she used to reserve for me. I crept closer to the sliding door, my heart pounding with shame and fear. Most of the conversation was too quiet to make out, but then she said something that made my blood freeze. He's still useful. In English, clear as day. He's still useful, but getting suspicious. We need to be more careful. There was a pause, then a laugh that sounded nothing like the woman I'd married. No, he doesn't know anything. He's too trusting, too lonely. I stood there in my own kitchen, in the dark, listening to my wife discuss me like I was a business asset. Too trusting, too lonely. The words hit me like physical blows, each one confirming fears I'd been trying to suppress for months. I wanted to burst through that door, to confront her, to demand explanations. But I also couldn't bear to hear what those explanations might be. Instead, I crept back to bed and lay there until sunrise, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how I'd become this person. This man who eavesdropped on his own wife, who made excuses for behavior he knew was wrong, who chose willful blindness over the truth because the truth was too terrifying to face. The next morning, I made breakfast like nothing had happened. Eggs over easy, toast, fresh fruit. Namthip came to the table looking tired but professional, already dressed for work. "Sleep well?" I asked, my voice sounding false even to my own ears. She nodded absently, checking her phone as she ate. Long day ahead. Immigration office, then 3 client meetings. Might be late again. I wanted to ask her about the phone call. Wanted to ask her what she'd meant about me being useful. Wanted to ask her if anything between us had ever been real. Instead, I poured her more coffee and said, "Drive safely." Because sometimes, when you're drowning, you choose to go down quietly rather than thrash around and make a scene. Sometimes the fear of being alone is stronger than the fear of being lied to. I'd been rehearsing the confrontation for 2 weeks, but when the moment finally came, all my carefully planned words abandoned me. It was a Tuesday evening in early May, and Namthip had just walked through the door after another late client meeting. She looked tired, but also somehow relieved, like she'd successfully navigated another difficult day. That relief, more than anything else, made me realize I couldn't keep pretending. "We need to talk," I said from the kitchen table where I'd been sitting for the past hour, staring at her phone records that I'd requested from our shared account. My hands were shaking and my voice cracked on the word talk. She set down her purse and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not surprise, exactly. More like resignation. Okay, she said simply. She didn't ask what about. Didn't try to deflect or change the subject. Just walked over to the table and sat down across from me, her hands folded in her lap like she was attending a business meeting. That calmness, that complete lack of shock or confusion, told me everything I needed to know before I even opened my mouth. The phone calls, I began, then stopped. My throat felt like it was closing up. The money transfers, the marriage business, David K., Uncle Mook. I was listing evidence like I was in a courtroom, but I could hear how pathetic I sounded. How desperate. I know what's been happening, Namthip. I've known for weeks. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her face. The mask dropping, the professional courtesy disappearing. What remained was someone I didn't recognize, someone cold and calculating and completely unmoved by my obvious pain. What do you want me to say, Hal? Her voice was flat, matter of fact. That I'm sorry? That I love you? That this was all real? I want you to tell me the truth. The words came out as a whisper. She leaned back in her chair and studied me like I was a particularly interesting specimen. The truth is that you were lonely and naive and desperate for someone to make you feel important again. The truth is that I'm very good at my job. The truth is that marriages like ours are business transactions, whether people want to admit it or not. Each word hit me like a physical blow, but I couldn't look away from her face. This was who she really was, I realized. Not the caring woman who'd held my hand during visa interviews, not the gentle partner who'd helped me navigate a foreign country, not the loving wife who'd kissed me goodnight for months. This cold, clinical person sitting across from me discussing our marriage like it was a completed project. But you said you loved me. I hated how broken I sounded, but I couldn't help it. She shrugged. I say a lot of things. It's part of the service. You wanted to feel loved, so I made you feel loved. You wanted to feel needed, so I let you take care of me. You wanted to feel like you belonged here, so I showed you around like you were special. She paused, tilting her head slightly. Did it work? Did you feel those things? Yes. The admission felt like bleeding. Then I did my job well. She stood up from the table, and I realized she was about to leave. Just like that. No shouting, no tears, no dramatic confrontation. Just a clean, professional conclusion to what I'd thought was love. Wait, I said, standing up so quickly my chair fell backward. That's it? You're just leaving? She turned back to me, and for a moment I thought I saw something like pity in her eyes. Hal, you were never supposed to stay this long. This whole thing, it was supposed to be 6 months. Get your visa, get your residency status sorted, then we'd have a quiet divorce and you'd be grateful for the help. But you got attached. You started talking about growing old together, about buying property, about bringing your friends from America to visit. The room felt like it was tilting. So everything was a lie. She considered this for a moment. Not everything. I did enjoy your cooking, and you were kinder than most of my clients. Less demanding, less entitled. She picked up her purse from where she'd set it by the door. But yes, Hal, everything that mattered to you was a lie. I wanted to scream at her, to rage about the money she'd taken, the months of my life she'd stolen, the way she'd made me complicit in my own deception. But all I could manage was a broken whisper. Why? She looked at me one last time before opening the door. Because you let me. After she left, I sat alone in that apartment we'd shared, holding her empty teacup from breakfast, trying to understand how I'd become this person. This man, who'd been so desperate for love that he'd ignored every red flag, explained away every inconsistency, chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of traffic outside. I thought about calling someone, my ex-wife Linda, maybe, or my old neighbor in Portland. But what would I say? That I'd moved halfway around the world and fallen for the oldest scam in the book? That I'd confused loneliness with love, desperation with romance? That I'd been so afraid of being alone that I'd chosen to be used instead? The first letter took me 3 hours to write and 2 minutes to delete. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table for days, staring at blank paper, trying to find words that would make sense of what had happened between us. Dear Namthip, it began. I need you to know that what I felt was real, even if what you felt wasn't. But halfway through, I realized I was still trying to convince her of something, still seeking some kind of validation or closure that she had no interest in providing. The second letter was angrier, full of accusations and demands for explanations. You took advantage of a grieving man, I wrote. You saw someone vulnerable, and you fed on that vulnerability like a parasite. But when I read it back, I sounded like every bitter expat I'd ever met, raging about Thai women who'd wronged them, refusing to take any responsibility for their own choices. I didn't want to be that man. The third letter was the one I almost sent. It was shorter, simpler. I forgive you, it said. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying this anger is destroying what's left of me. I hope you find whatever it is you're really looking for. I even walked to the post office with it, stood in line for 20 minutes, held it in my hands at the counter, but in the end, I couldn't do it. Forgiveness felt too much like surrender, and I wasn't ready to surrender yet. Instead, I started walking. Every morning at sunrise down to Kata Beach, along the shore for 2 or 3 miles, then back through the old town where tourists were just beginning to stir. The walks helped me think, helped me process the magnitude of what had happened without the distraction of trying to fix it or explain it or make it mean something it didn't mean. On one of these morning walks, I met Father Michael, an Irish priest who ran a small mission near the market. He was feeding stray cats behind his church when I walked by, and something about the simple kindness of the gesture made me stop. American? He asked, looking up from a bowl of rice he was putting down. You have that look about you, like someone working through something difficult. We started talking, and before I knew it, I was telling him everything. Not for absolution or spiritual guidance, but just for the relief of saying it all out loud to someone who had no stake in the story. He listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, asking gentle questions that helped me see patterns I'd been too close to notice. The hardest part, I told him during one of our morning conversations, is realizing how complicit I was in my own deception. She didn't force me to ignore the red flags. She didn't make me choose hope over evidence. I did that all on my own. Father Michael scattered rice for a particularly skittish tabby cat and considered this. Self-deception is a powerful force, he said. Sometimes it's the only way we can survive disappointment, but it becomes dangerous when we mistake it for wisdom. I started cooking for the monks at his mission once a week. Nothing elaborate, just simple meals that could feed 20 people without costing too much. It felt good to use my skills for something meaningful, to contribute to a community that didn't want anything from me except the food itself. The monks were gracious and appreciative, but they didn't treat me like I was special for helping. I was just another person doing what he could. The visa situation resolved itself in the most anticlimactic way possible. A letter arrived from the immigration office informing me that my marriage visa application had been denied due to insufficient documentation and questionable circumstances. Uncle Mook had apparently disappeared along with Namthip, taking whatever money was left of the fees I'd paid for expedited processing. I'd have to start over with a retirement visa, the legitimate way, through proper channels with real lawyers who charged reasonable fees and didn't promise miracles. I moved out of the apartment we'd shared and into a small studio near the old town. 1 room, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom with a shower that barely worked. It was exactly what I needed. Simple, honest, unpretentious. No space for self-deception or romantic fantasies. Just enough room for a man to figure out who he really was when nobody was performing for him or trying to sell him something. The loneliness was crushing at first. Not the manageable solitude I'd experienced after my divorce, but a deeper isolation that came from realizing how completely I'd been fooled. Every memory I'd treasured from our relationship was now suspect. Had she ever actually enjoyed my cooking, or was that just part of the performance? Had she really been charmed by my stories about restaurant work in Portland, or was she just gathering information she could use later? Had any moment between us been genuine, or was I that easy to manipulate? But slowly, very slowly, the walks and the cooking and the simple routine of a solitary life began to teach me something I hadn't expected: the difference between being alone and being lonely. Being alone was a circumstance. Being lonely was a choice. I'd been lonely in my marriage to Linda, lonely even when surrounded by restaurant staff and regular customers, lonely in that big house in Portland, with all its reminders of a life that had never quite fit. Here, in this tiny studio, with its broken shower and temperamental air conditioning, I wasn't lonely. I was just alone. And alone, I was discovering, wasn't something to be fixed or cured or escaped from. It was just a state of being that could be peaceful if you stopped fighting it. 6 months after Namthip left, I got a message from David K. He'd found my number somehow, probably through the same networks that had connected him to her in the first place. "Heard you went through the same thing I did?" his text said. "Want to grab a beer and compare war stories?" I stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it without responding. I wasn't ready to join the bitter expat club, wasn't ready to bond with other men over the ways we'd been fooled by Thai women. That kind of camaraderie felt like another trap, another way of avoiding the harder work of understanding my own role in what had happened. The truth I'm still learning to live with is this: Namthip didn't destroy my life. She didn't steal my happiness or rob me of my future. She showed me something about myself that I hadn't wanted to see, something about how desperate I'd become for validation, how willing I'd been to trade dignity for the illusion of being needed. The money she took, the months she wasted, the lies she told, those were her choices. But the decision to believe those lies, to ignore the evidence, to choose comfortable deception over uncomfortable truth, those were mine. I still cook for the monks every Tuesday. I still take my morning walks along the beach. I still live in the same small studio, though I've made it more comfortable over time, added a few plants, some books, a decent coffee maker. I've learned enough Thai to have simple conversations with my neighbors, and I've stopped feeling like I need to be special or different, or more than just another aging foreigner trying to make a quiet life in a place that doesn't owe him anything. Sometimes I see women who remind me of her. The confident walk, the professional smile, the way she could make you feel like the most interesting person in the room. And I feel a familiar flutter of possibility, a whisper that maybe this time would be different. But now I recognize that whisper for what it is: not hope, but hunger. The same desperate need that made me such an easy mark the first time. The love I thought I had with Namthip wasn't real. But the lesson is, I learned that I'd rather be alone with the truth than together with a lie. I learned that peace isn't something someone else can give you. It's something you have to build for yourself, brick by brick, choice by choice. I learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop trying to be saved by someone else. I'm 62 now. My hair is grayer, my back aches more in the mornings, and I sleep alone in a bed that's just big enough for one person. But I wake up every day knowing exactly who I am and exactly what I have. It's not the life I dreamed of when I first came to Thailand, looking for something to fill the hole that Linda's departure and Margaret's death had left in me. But it's honest. It's mine. And after everything that's happened, that feels like enough.